Maria Clementina of Austria entered history not with the triumphant cry expected of a Habsburg daughter, but with a frail breath that foretold a lifetime of struggle. She was born coughing, grew up coughing, and walked into adulthood with lungs that never once matched the ambitions of the dynasty she belonged to. In a family built on alliances, heirs, and endurance, she was the quiet exception, a princess whose body betrayed her before the world could. Married off while still weak, exiled to a foreign court that offered neither comfort nor affection, she withered faster than anyone dared admit. Her story is not the tale of a scandalous royal or a political schemer. It is the small, silent tragedy of a young woman asked to carry burdens far heavier than her breath could bear. Maria Clementina of Austria entered her family's world with a quietness that stood in stark contrast to the robust lineage she belonged to. Born on March 1st, 797, in Florence, at that moment still the capital of her father Leopold's Grand Duchy of Tuscany, she was the 10th child in a dynasty that measured strength in numbers, ambition, and the physical vitality of its heirs. Yet from the earliest days, attendants and physicians sensed that this child was different. Where other Habsburg infants cried loudly, kicked vigorously, and grew with an almost predictable sturdiness, Clementina seemed suspended between presence and fragility, a small, pale girl whose breathing never felt entirely secure. Those who cared for her remembered how she coughed in short, persistent bursts, as if each breath cost her more than she could afford. Every winter draft rattled her chest. Every mild cold lingered far longer than it should have. Every fever threatened to become something far more dangerous. Her nurses often held her closer than the others, not out of favoritism, but out of an instinctive fear. The fear that if they let her go too long without warmth, without careful watching, she might simply slip away. In a palace filled with running feet, clattering toys, and the loud competing voices of a dozen siblings, Maria Clementina often remained the quiet center of concern, watched not with the proud expectation given to future political brides, but with the anxious tenderness reserved for a child who might not survive. Her siblings would race through the spacious hallways of the Pitti Palace, their laughter echoing through the long stone corridors, while Clementina stayed behind with a governess, wrapped in layers of soft wool, observing life rather than joining it. She preferred to sit near windows, especially in the afternoons when Florentine sunlight softened the rooms. She would watch the dust drift in the air rather than risk exhausting herself with a simple act of play. Her father, the future Emperor Leopold II, was a pragmatic man, intelligent, forward-thinking, and fond of his children, yet painfully aware of their political roles. He knew that daughters were valuable, but only if they could survive to marriageable age and sustain the demands placed upon them by dynastic alliances. With Clementina, there was always a shadow of uncertainty. He visited her often in her early years, not with the distant formality expected of an emperor, but with the quiet worry of a father who feared that affection might have to be measured in years rather than decades. Her mother, Maria Luisa of Spain, was more openly emotional, frequently asking the court physicians whether her delicate daughter would ever be strong enough for life. Their answers were never direct. They spoke of chronic weakness, insufficient vigor, and poor resistance to cold. In the 18th century, these were polite courtly euphemisms for a condition modern historians believe was an early manifestation of tuberculosis, a disease that would eventually claim her entirely. In childhood portraits of the imperial family, Clementina's fragility is unmistakable. While her sisters stand upright, adorned with symbolic attributes of Habsburg prosperity and Spanish heritage, Clementina often appears smaller. Her posture slightly curved, her expression softer, as though the act of holding herself upright was already a quiet battle. Her attendants would coax her to play small, gentle games that would not strain her breathing. Even short walks in palace gardens required careful pacing. She loved flowers, especially the pale varieties that mirrored her own complexion. Yet, even spring pollen sometimes triggered fits of coughing that left her eyes watery and her chest shaking. The palace physicians restricted her activities constantly, fearing that any exertion would worsen her condition. This led to a childhood structured around avoidance. Avoiding cold, avoiding excitement, avoiding anything that might make her fragile lungs collapse further. The contrast between Clementina and her siblings was stark. The Habsburg children were famously vigorous, often described by foreign visitors as healthy, loud, and numerous. The large family of Leopold and Maria Luisa was known for its energy and brightness. In this swirl of activity, Clementina's quietness became a defining characteristic. Her older siblings, especially Archduchess Maria Theresa and Archduchess Maria Anna, tried to include her in their activities, but Clementina would inevitably withdraw, struggling for breath after even the most innocent excitement. The other children learned to soften their play when she was near, speaking more gently, moving more slowly, as though they too sensed her precariousness. Despite her physical weakness, Clementina had a gentle intelligence that endeared her to those closest to her. She loved stories, especially those her governess read aloud on long afternoons when coughing kept her indoors. She had a small collection of devotional books bound in delicate leather, gifts from her mother, and she spent hours tracing her fingers over their gilded illustrations. Her tutors noticed that she absorbed lessons quietly but thoroughly, preferring reading to conversation, contemplation to activity. She developed a sensitive nature, the kind easily overwhelmed by noise, harshness, or even too much attention. This sensitivity, while endearing, also made her more vulnerable to the pressures of court life, pressures she would one day be unable to escape. As she grew, the family's move from Florence to Vienna in 1790 only worsened matters. The cold of the Austrian capital assaulted Clementina's weak lungs, and the long, formal rituals of the imperial court demanded a stamina she did not have. Each winter left her thinner. Each spring found her recovering from illnesses that seemed never entirely cured. Viennese courtiers whispered that the emperor's 10th daughter was too delicate for her future, though no one dared say so aloud. Her parents tried to protect her from the harshest obligations, but a Habsburg princess, no matter how fragile, could not be shielded forever. And so, as Clementina entered her adolescence, her fragility became not just a physical condition, but the silent force shaping her destiny. She stood on the threshold of a life that demanded strength, endurance, and political usefulness. And she possessed none of these things. Her body, already failing her, would soon collide with expectations far heavier than she could bear. Maria Clementina's childhood unfolded like a fragile melody, tenderly played, yet always at risk of breaking under its own quiet weight. In the vast, ornate world of the Habsburg court, a place known for ceremony, precision, and the relentless expectation of strength, she moved softly, a child whose gentleness felt out of place amid the political machinery surrounding her. Her parents' affection for her was unmistakable, yet it was bound tightly to an ever-present fear. The fear that love alone could not protect a child whose lungs were already failing her. From the time she could walk, it was clear that she did not possess the energetic posture of her sisters, nor the sturdy composure of her brothers. She walked as though every step was an effort, her breathing shallow, her gestures restrained not out of shyness alone, but out of necessity. Those who served the family quickly adapted to her needs. Her governess placed extra shawls around her shoulders, lit braziers earlier in her room than in any of her siblings, and ensured every corridor she passed through had its windows closed against the slightest draft. These gestures, though small, were constant reminders that Clementina lived in a world where the slightest shift in temperature could decide whether she spent the next weeks reading quietly in her armchair or bedridden with a violent cough. Even within the safety of the palace walls, her childhood was shaped by restrictions that other children of her age would never understand. Her siblings attended riding lessons, dancing instruction, fencing practice, and long ceremonial walks through palace gardens, all the training expected of imperial offspring destined to rule or marry into Europe's powerful houses. Clementina, however, was excused from nearly all such activities. Her doctors warned that undue exertion could jeopardize her already weakened lungs. As a result, she listened to the distant echoes of her siblings' lively training sessions while she remained inside, wrapped in soft blankets, tracing her fingers across the pages of storybooks. Her tutors approached her lessons with gentleness and patience, and though she absorbed knowledge with a quiet intelligence, she often grew tired long before the hour was over. Her attendants knew the signs well: the slight paling of her lips, the dryness that overtook her breathing, the trembling of her small hands. They would stop immediately, open the windows for a breath of controlled air, or escort her back to bed before the dizziness overwhelmed her. To them, she was not simply one of the many Habsburg archduchesses. She was a child whose life seemed to hang by the thinnest thread. Despite her fragility, the court loved her with an affection reserved for the most vulnerable. Courtiers who gossiped freely about politics or the ambitions of other royal children lowered their voices when speaking of Clementina, as though any harshness might injure her. Her nurses, many of whom had served the imperial family for years, treated her with the kind of devotion usually seen in private households rather than palaces. They admired her patience, her soft-spoken manner, her ability to smile through discomfort. They admired, too, the way she found beauty in small things: the warmth of sunlight through lace curtains, the sound of distant bells drifting from the city, the gentle flutter of a canary's wings in its gilded cage. These small joys became her refuge, her way of experiencing life when the physical world often overwhelmed her. The move to Vienna in 1790, following Leopold's accession to the imperial throne, marked a turning point, one that filled her childhood with even greater tension. Florence had been milder, more forgiving. Vienna was harsher, colder, and far more demanding in ritual and formality. The imperial palace at Hofburg was magnificent but drafty, its long stone corridors notoriously difficult to heat in winter. Physicians warned the family that Clementina's lungs would not tolerate the climate well, and they were correct. Her first Viennese winter brought prolonged illness. Weeks confined to bed, nights soaked with feverish sweat, mornings beginning with deep, rattling coughs that frightened even the most experienced attendants. The court did everything possible to protect her. Warm bricks at her feet, herbal tonics, wool-lined gowns. But the cold still seeped in, stealing her strength with a persistence that felt almost personal. This vulnerability isolated her further. Her siblings began participating in more public ceremonies, increasingly essential to the political image of an imperial dynasty redefining itself under a new emperor. Clementina, meanwhile, was often excused from these obligations out of necessity. She missed birthdays, receptions, musical evenings, and religious festivals. Not because she was forgotten, but because participation would likely leave her too ill to stand. And so, while her brothers and sisters learned the rhythm of court life. Clementina learned the rhythm of quiet rooms, the slow chiming of clocks, the soft footsteps of attendants, the muted voices of courtiers passing by her door on their way to engagements she would never attend. Though her parents loved her deeply, they were realists. Leopold II, burdened with reforms and political pressures, understood clearly that a daughter as fragile as Clementina might never fulfill the dynastic role required of her. Maria Louisa, emotional and deeply religious, prayed constantly for her daughter's health. Yet she too saw the harsh truth in Clementina's drawn face and thin arms. Their concern, though genuine, became yet another weight on Clementina's delicate spirit. Even as a child, she sensed that her body was not merely weak, it was a source of worry, of anxiety, of unspoken sorrow. Yet for all this fragility, Clementina possessed a rare sweetness that softened the atmosphere around her. She never complained, even when breathing became painful, even when her world shrank to a few heated rooms. She was grateful for every kindness, and she returned affection with a gentle sincerity that touched everyone who knew her. It was this sweetness, not strength, not ambition, not political value, that defined her childhood. And it was this sweetness, so at odds with the unforgiving expectations of her dynasty, that made her future all the more tragic. By the late 1780s, as Europe simmered with anxieties over revolutions, shifting alliances, and the fragile balance of dynastic power, Maria Clementina's quiet existence was slowly being overshadowed by something far more relentless than illness: politics. The Habsburgs, like every great ruling family of the era, used marriage as their most powerful diplomatic currency, forging alliances not with words alone, but with the bodies and futures of their daughters. And Clementina, delicate though she was still a princess, still a potential link between thrones. Her fragility did not erase her value. It merely complicated it. Behind closed doors, far from the warmth of Clementina's childhood rooms, discussions began among ministers, advisors, and royal relatives about how she might still serve the dynasty's interests. The conclusion they reached was as predictable as it was devastating. She would marry into the Bourbon Two Sicilies, strengthening ties between Vienna and Naples at a moment when stability seemed increasingly precious. The chosen groom was Prince Francis of Naples, later Francis I of the Two Sicilies, a man known even in youth for his cold, stiff temperament. He was not cruel, nor was he malicious, but he was deeply withdrawn, almost painfully uncomfortable with emotional expression. His disposition was the opposite of what a fragile young bride might have needed. Yet temperament did not matter in diplomatic marriages. What mattered was lineage, Catholic unity, and strategic advantage. And on these points, the match was nearly perfect. Negotiations began in 1790, when Clementina was only 13. Still struggling through her Viennese winters, still coughing her way through the simplest activities, still far more child than woman. Her opinion was neither requested nor recorded. A Habsburg princess did not choose her future. Her future was chosen for her long before she had the strength to protest. Though her parents cared for her deeply, they too surrendered to the logic of dynastic necessity. Leopold II believed in duty to the empire above all else, and even Maria Louisa, ever tender, ever protective, could not deny the political weight of an alliance with Naples. Perhaps they told themselves that warmer climates might improve Clementina's health, that the gentler Mediterranean air could ease her lungs and lengthen her life. Or perhaps they simply hoped she would grow stronger with time. But hope cannot alter the nature of a body already in quiet collapse. As the marriage plan solidified, Clementina, barely old enough to understand the magnitude of what awaited her, watched her future being shaped without her voice. She was instructed in the customs of the Neapolitan court, tutored more intensely in languages and etiquette, and reminded, in the soft, apologetic tone nobles use when delivering commands dressed as kindness, that her marriage would be a service to the empire. For Francis, the engagement was a formality. He had little interest in his bride and even less understanding of her condition. Known for his stiffness, his aloofness, his preference for routine over human connection, Francis approached the marriage as he approached all things in life, without curiosity, without sentiment, and without warmth. He was not a man who sought companionship, and certainly not a man who could offer emotional refuge. Clementina, who needed tenderness more than most, was being sent toward a life that would give her none of it. She did not know Francis. She had not met him. And even when the time came for them to exchange ceremonial gestures, they remained strangers bound only by signatures and ceremony. When the wedding finally took place in 1797, Clementina was 20, fragile, pale, and already showing the unmistakable signs of a body weakening under the slow rot of tuberculosis. Portraits from this period show a young woman whose beauty was quiet and sorrowful, marked less by vibrant youth than by a kind of resigned delicacy. Her eyes held the softness of someone who had learned helplessness early, someone who had spent her life being protected, yet never truly safe. On her wedding day, courtiers admired her grace, her modesty, her gentle demeanor. But beneath the admiration lay whispers. Whispers about her health. Whispers about whether she could survive the journey south. Whispers about whether she could bear children. Yet no whisper, no physician's warning, no tremor in her breath was strong enough to stop the march of diplomacy. The journey from Vienna to Naples was long and exhausting, a physical trial even for a healthy woman. For Clementina, it was nearly catastrophic. She traveled through changing climates, endured sudden shifts in temperature, and spent days confined in carriages where dust irritated her lungs and the motion triggered constant fatigue. By the time she reached Naples, she was thinner than before, paler than before, and already longing for the safety she had left behind. But safety was not part of her future. Naples greeted her not with warmth, but with formality. She arrived not as a cherished daughter, but as a political bride, a foreign princess who needed to adjust quickly, fulfill her duties, and produce heirs. Francis greeted her correctly, politely, and without affection. He was neither cruel nor welcoming. He was simply absent in spirit, a man who performed the rituals required of him, but gave little else. Their first days as husband and wife were marked by silence, by rigid courtesies, by distance that neither of them attempted to bridge. Clementina, who had hoped at least for a hint of companionship, found herself more alone than ever. Alone in a palace whose language she struggled with. Alone among courtiers who measured her worth by her fertility. Alone beside a husband who viewed her not as a partner, but as a formality completed. In that silence, in that emotional coldness, the tragedy of Maria Clementina's marriage began to take shape. She had escaped one anxiety, the fear of disappointing her dynasty, only to enter another, the fear that she would disappear entirely within a life chosen for her, a life her delicate lungs had never been strong enough to bear. Maria Clementina's arrival in Naples should have been the beginning of a new chapter, the kind of hopeful transition royal marriages were meant to represent. Instead, it felt like an exile, a quiet displacement from everything that had once anchored her fragile existence. Leaving Vienna had already strained her weak lungs and her timid spirit. But Naples confronted her with an entirely different world, one that overwhelmed her with its intensity. The city was loud, hot and chaotic, alive with scents of the sea, the chatter of crowded markets, and the unpredictable moods of the southern climate. For a girl raised in the controlled, ceremonial rhythm of the Habsburg court, the sensory force of Naples struck her like a storm. The Mediterranean sun, so warm and celebrated by the locals, exhausted her quickly, burning her pale skin and tightening her already strained breathing. The humidity clung to her body, making every inhale feel heavier than the one before. Even the festive melodies drifting through the city, lively, cheerful, filled with the unrestrained joy of Neapolitan culture, felt alien to her ears, more jarring than inviting. She found herself retreating indoors almost immediately, hiding in quiet rooms where she could catch her breath and quell the rising panic that came whenever her lungs betrayed her in this unfamiliar environment. The royal palace at Naples, though grand, offered little comfort. Its vast halls, adorned with portraits and tapestries celebrating Bourbon greatness, felt colder to her than the Hofburg ever had. She missed the smell of Viennese winters, the muted tones of her childhood rooms, the hushed concern of attendants who had known her since infancy. Here, she was a foreign princess in a court that cared more about political stability than her well-being. She had no friends, no sisters at her side, no familiar faces to guide her. The courtiers watched her politely, but without warmth, as though silently assessing whether this thin Austrian bride would survive long enough to fulfill her dynastic purpose. Their politeness was not cruelty, but indifference. And indifference can wound more deeply than hostility. Her loneliness was intensified by her husband's emotional distance. Prince Francis, already known for his rigid temperament, seemed incapable of forming even the simplest bond with her. He was courteous in public, but detached in private, offering no tenderness, no conversation, no companionship. What Clementina needed was reassurance, a hand on hers during a coughing spell, a gentle word when homesickness overtook her, a partner who understood that her fragility was not a burden, but a call for care. Instead, she received silence. Francis spent his days absorbed in routine, governance, and the expectations of his own court, leaving Clementina to wander the palace in quiet solitude. Even at meals, they spoke little. Even in shared spaces, they seemed miles apart. She was a bride in name but a stranger in practice, married not to a man, but to a role. In letters she sent back to her family, few of which survive, but many of which were remembered by those who read them, Clementina expressed a profound homesickness. She missed the slow, careful warmth of Vienna, the structured calm of her upbringing, and above all, the presence of her sisters, who had always softened the harshness of court life. She wrote of how the nights in Naples felt unbearably long, how the palace's corridors echoed when she walked them alone, how even her attendants seemed foreign in their habits and speech. She never openly criticized Francis, but the absence of affection in her marriage seeped into her words in subtle ways. A sadness between the lines, a longing for something she had never truly experienced. Physically, Naples did not rejuvenate her as her family had hoped. Instead, it weakened her further. The constant heat drained her energy, and the dampness near the sea worsened her coughing fits. Physicians at the Neapolitan court tried new tonics and remedies, but they misread her symptoms, attributing her decline to adjustment or nerves rather than the tuberculosis already consuming her lungs. Their treatments did little, and Clementina's quiet suffering continued in rooms that felt too large for her small, trembling body. Some mornings she could barely rise from bed, and some afternoons she walked only a few steps before needing to sit down, pressing a hand to her chest as if to steady her breath. Yet even in these fragile moments, there was no comforting voice, no husband at her side. The palace functioned around her as though she were an ornament, present but insignificant, admired but unnoticed. The court judged her not by her suffering, but by her usefulness. Could she produce heirs? Could she appear at ceremonies? Could she smile through her weakness and stand through the endless rituals expected of a royal woman? The answers, in their eyes, mattered far more than the slow, suffocating collapse of her health. And so she performed when she could, forcing herself to attend events that left her trembling for hours afterward. She learned to suppress her cough in public, to steady her hands when they shook, to smile softly even when breathing became a battle. The effort exhausted her, grinding down what little strength she possessed. Every appearance required days of recovery afterward. Days spent lying in darkened rooms, attendants cooling her fevered skin with damp cloths, or urging her to drink warm broth she could barely swallow. As months passed, Clementina faded further into the shadows of her marriage, her voice growing weaker, her presence dimmer. She was surrounded by people yet achingly alone, trapped in a palace that expected her to endure but offered nothing in return. Her life in Naples became the slow unraveling of a girl who had never been strong enough for the world's demands. A girl who had been taken from the warmth of her family and placed into a cold marriage that neither cherished her nor protected her. In that emotional and physical isolation, the seeds of her tragedy took root. Growing silently toward the inevitable end, her fragile body was already unable to escape. Pregnancy, in the eyes of a royal court, is a triumph. Proof of fertility, proof of alliance, proof that a princess has fulfilled the duty for which she was married. But for Maria Clementina, whose lungs had never known a day of true strength, pregnancy was not triumph, but terror. It was the moment her fragile health, long held together by careful routines and constant protection, began to fracture beyond repair. Barely a year into her cold and distant marriage, she conceived her first child. Naples celebrated with fireworks, music, and displays of Bourbon pride. But inside the palace, Clementina's body trembled under a burden it had never been built to bear. From the early weeks, she felt the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones like lead. Her breathing grew shallower, her coughs deeper. The hormonal changes that invigorated healthy women pushed Clementina toward collapse. She slept in long, feverish stretches, waking drenched in sweat. Even walking across her room left her gasping, gripping the nearest piece of furniture for balance. Physicians, trained more in ritual than in science, reassured the court that pregnancy would strengthen her constitution. But they did not see the way her attendants quietly panicked, exchanging worried glances each time she struggled for breath. Her body, already compromised by the slow march of tuberculosis, was now required to nourish another life. The strain magnified every symptom she had ever endured. Her appetite vanished, yet she was pressured to eat for the child. Food tasted metallic to her. Even small meals triggered violent coughing fits that left her throat raw and her chest burning. She lost weight instead of gaining it, her wrists thinning to delicate bones, her cheeks hollowing, her eyes darkening with fatigue. She often fainted without warning, collapsing into the arms of attendants who no longer dared leave her side. Despite her obvious suffering, the court was relentless. She was expected to appear at ceremonies, to smile before foreign envoys, to represent the strength of the Bourbon-Habsburg alliance. Each time she rose from bed to dress in silk gowns, to sit through long masses, to endure hours of standing, she paid for it with days of agony afterward. Her cough deepened into something harsher, echoing through the silent corridors late at night, like a sorrowful rhythm no one wanted to acknowledge. When she went into labor in 1798, she did so with a body dangerously depleted. The delivery was long, exhausting, and far more perilous than those trained midwives expected. Clementina endured it quietly, tears slipping down her temples as she struggled to breathe between contractions. When Princess Caroline was finally born, healthy and crying, the court erupted in relief and celebration. Congratulations flooded the palace. Congratulations to the father. Congratulations to the alliance. Congratulations to the dynasty. Very few remembered to congratulate the mother. Clementina lay pale and trembling, too weak to lift her newborn daughter, too exhausted to whisper more than a few words before slipping into a long, feverish sleep. She gained no strength after the birth, whereas other young mothers recovered slowly. Clementina continued to decline. Her cough persisted day and night. Her fevers spiked unpredictably, and her breathing became so shallow that attendants feared she would stop altogether. Yet even before she regained the ability to walk without assistance, the court began whispering about a second pregnancy. Naples wanted heirs, not one, but many. Francis wanted security. Ministers wanted continuity. No one wanted to consider the obvious truth. Clementina's first pregnancy had nearly killed her. Her body needed rest, nourishment, and time, but duty allowed none of it. And in 1799, barely a year after Caroline's birth, she was with child again. This time, the strain hit her immediately. Morning sickness turned into day-long nausea, accompanied by coughing fits that left traces of blood on her handkerchiefs. Her fevers returned with terrifying intensity, drenching her bed linens nightly. She grew so thin that court observers whispered she looked transparent, like a figure made of glass that might shatter with one wrong breath. The physicians, now concerned but still bound by court expectations, began to suspect what Vienna's doctors had quietly feared for years. Tuberculosis had fully engulfed her. The disease that had shadowed her since childhood now advanced with merciless speed. Clementina felt it too. The creeping numbness in her limbs, the stabbing pain behind her ribs, the sudden moments when her vision blurred and her heart raced uncontrollably. She often pressed her hands to her chest as if she could hold her lungs together by sheer will. The palace grew quieter around her, not out of compassion, but out of the discomfort of watching a young princess disintegrate while carrying the heir expected of her. She spent long days in darkened rooms, curtains drawn against the oppressive Neapolitan sun, breathing in shallow gasps while attendants whispered prayers they hoped she would not hear. Her world shrank to her bed, her suffering, and the silent knowledge that the life within her was draining what remained of her own. By the time she gave birth to her second child, Prince Ferdinand, in 1800, she was nearly unrecognizable. The delivery almost ended her life. She survived, but only barely, and only to face the inevitable. The disease that had pursued her since childhood was now fully awakened, devouring her strength with each passing week. Her pregnancies had not just exhausted her. They had destroyed the delicate balance that had kept her alive. She had given Naples 2 children, 2 heirs for a dynasty that had never shown her love. And in doing so, she had surrendered the last pieces of her fragile health. A sacrifice no one acknowledged, and one that would soon lead her toward an early, lonely death. By the turn of the century, as the royal court of Naples celebrated the safe arrival of an heir, Maria Clementina was entering the final, most merciless stage of her illness. Tuberculosis, whispered about but never fully acknowledged, had already settled deep within her lungs long before her marriage. Pregnancy had merely pulled away the last barriers protecting her fragile body. Now, with 2 children depending on her and an entire dynasty unaware of the extent of her suffering, the disease advanced with a cold, deliberate inevitability. What began as a faint, lingering weakness became a constant, suffocating presence that followed her from room to room, tightening its grasp with every shallow breath. Clementina no longer had moments of relief. She lived inside a storm of exhaustion that never lifted. Her chest ached constantly, a heavy, throbbing pain that spread along her ribs and down her spine. She coughed until her throat burned, until her vision blurred with tears she didn't mean to shed, until her slender frame shook with effort. Her attendants learned to hold her shoulders steady during the worst episodes, whispering reassurances while her body heaved helplessly beneath their hands. Nights were the cruelest. Long after the palace around her had fallen silent, she lay awake fighting for breath, drenched in cold sweat, her gown clinging to her thin body. The sheets, changed multiple times a night, could not keep up with the fever that consumed her from within. She slept in short, broken fragments, 10 minutes here, 5 minutes there, never falling deeply enough into rest to escape the pain. In the darkness, she could hear her own breathing, a wet, rattling sound that frightened even her, as though each inhale might be her last. There were moments when she instinctively reached out for someone, anyone, to hold her hand, not out of fear of death, but out of fear of facing it alone. And most nights, her hand found only empty air. Her attendants did what they could. They brought cool cloths for her forehead, warm blankets for her shivering limbs, broths she rarely had the strength to swallow. They whispered to her gently, calling her cara principessa in soft Italian accents, attempting to comfort a woman whose suffering they could not alleviate. The court physicians visited daily, prescribing tonics, inhalations, and powders that offered no real relief. They debated among themselves in hushed voices, knowing the truth but unwilling to speak it aloud. The princess was dying. Every time Clementina attempted to sit upright, she gasped sharply, clutching her chest as though stabbed from within. The disease had begun to erode not only her lungs, but her physical strength entirely. Her collarbones protruded sharply, her cheeks sank inward, her skin became almost translucent, as if the light passed through her rather than rested upon her. Even the smallest task, lifting a spoon, turning her head, whispering a word, exhausted her. Writing became her only escape from the oppressive silence. With trembling hands, she penned letters to her sisters in Vienna, pouring into them a mixture of longing, resignation, and fear. One letter, remembered by those who saw it, read, "Every breath feels like a blade inside my chest. If only I could see home again, just once more. Perhaps the air there would forgive me." She never asked her family to rescue her. She knew they could not. But she confessed the deepest truth of her heart. Naples had never been home, and she felt herself disappearing within its walls. Her sister Maria Theresa, the closest of her siblings, wrote back with desperation, offering prayers and begging her to hold on. But paper cannot cross oceans fast enough to save a dying woman, and words cannot rebuild a collapsing body. Through all of this, Francis remained emotionally distant, almost untouched by the tragedy unfolding in his household. Whether out of discomfort, detachment, or an inability to confront illness, he visited Clementina rarely. When he did, his presence brought no comfort. He stood at a polite distance, spoke in formal phrases, and departed quickly. Clementina, who had once hoped marriage might offer companionship, now understood fully that she would die as she had lived. Quietly, unnoticed, and without affection from the man who was meant to protect her. The loneliness of that realization weighed on her more heavily than the disease eating away at her lungs. The palace, always bustling with gossip and activity, began to fall strangely silent whenever she was mentioned. Servants, who had grown genuinely fond of her, looked down when her name arose, as if ashamed by their helplessness. Courtiers avoided her rooms, unwilling to face the fragile, fading figure who contradicted the image of royal strength they were expected to uphold. Even the corridors around her apartments felt dimmer, as though the palace itself were retreating from the quiet suffering taking place within its walls. By late 1801, Clementina could no longer leave her bed. The windows of her room were kept partially shuttered to protect her from the harsh sunlight, creating a soft, muted world of half-light, where shadows blended peacefully with embroidered curtains. Her breathing grew irregular, punctuated by long pauses that made her attendants hold theirs in fear. Yet even in these final weeks, she remained gentle, apologizing when she needed help, thanking those who cared for her with a soft smile that broke their hearts. She never raged against her fate. She simply endured it, as she had endured everything, with quiet dignity. Tuberculosis had not only taken her strength, it had taken the life she might have lived. She was 24, yet looked like a woman twice her age. She was a mother who barely had the strength to touch her own children. She was a princess who received no affection from her husband, and she was a human being slowly fading away while the world around her continued unchanged. In those final days, each breath became an act of courage, each moment of consciousness a fragile defiance against the inevitable. The disease had taken her body, but it had not taken her gentleness. And that gentleness, the one thing she had always possessed, flickered softly within her even as the rest of her life slipped quietly toward its end. By the autumn of 1801, the palace in Naples seemed to hold its breath, as if even its stone walls understood that a life was nearing its end. Maria Clementina, once a quiet, fragile child of Vienna, had become a pale, hollow figure whose presence felt more like a fading whisper than a living heartbeat. Her illness, no longer a shadow but a consuming force, had reduced her world to the confines of her dimly lit chamber. The royal physicians still visited out of obligation, still murmured plans for treatment, still insisted on the comforting lie that she might recover with rest. But the attendants who wiped the blood from her lips, who lifted her trembling body each morning, who stayed awake through the night listening to her painful breathing, knew the truth. She was dying. And she was dying slowly, softly, almost apologetically, as though she feared burdening those who cared for her. Her final weeks were marked by an exhaustion so deep that even consciousness felt like a struggle. She drifted in and out of waking moments, her thoughts blurred by fever and weakness. Sometimes she whispered for her children, little Caroline and the infant Ferdinand, but the effort of speaking often left her gasping. On rare occasions, the nursemaids brought the children quietly to her bedside, placing them gently beside their mother. Caroline would touch Clementina's hand with cautious curiosity, too young to understand why the adult's eyes filled with tears at the sight. Ferdinand, still an infant, rested against his mother's chest for moments at a time, though she was too weak to hold him. Even these brief encounters exhausted her, yet she cherished them, for they were among the last pieces of life she could still grasp. As her strength faded, the palace grew strangely still around her. The courtiers who once passed her rooms daily now stepped more quietly, their conversations reduced to hushed murmurs. The servants who adored her slowed their movements, as though afraid a sudden sound might shatter the fragile thread of life still tied to her frail body. The sunlight that filtered through the shutters softened into dim, golden light, creating an atmosphere of suspended time, as if the world itself were reluctant to move forward without her. Her husband, Francis, remained largely absent. He visited occasionally, short, formal visits marked by awkward silences and stiff gestures. But these moments offered no comfort. He stood near the doorway rather than at her bedside, spoke to her as though addressing a distant relative rather than a dying wife, and often departed before she could summon the breath to respond. To Clementina, who had once entered marriage with a shy hope of companionship, these visits confirmed a truth she had felt for years. She would not be loved by the man whose life was supposed to intertwine with hers. Yet even then, she did not resent him. She simply accepted the loneliness as she had accepted every burden placed upon her, quietly, gracefully, without protest. Those who truly cared for her were the attendants who had spent countless nights at her side. They held her hands during coughing fits, changed the linen soaked with sweat, whispered prayers in her ear when her breathing faltered. They were the ones who noticed how her fingers grew thinner, her skin colder, her pulse lighter with each passing day. They watched with helpless sorrow as the disease consumed her, taking from her not only her strength, but her ability to speak, to move, to stay awake. They had come to love her, not as a princess, but as a gentle soul whose suffering deserved more compassion than the world ever granted her. Toward the end, Clementina entered a state of profound calm. Her coughing fits grew less frequent, not because she was improving, but because her lungs were too weak to produce them. Her breath came in soft, shallow waves, each one slower than the last. She no longer asked for letters, no longer requested news from Vienna, no longer worried about appearances or duties. She seemed to exist in a state between worlds, aware of those around her, but too tired to respond. Her attendants said she often looked toward the window, as though hoping the breeze might carry her home, back to the familiar halls of her childhood, to the sisters who had loved her, to the gentle world she had been forced to leave behind. On the evening of November 15th, 1801, as the sky outside darkened into a deep Neapolitan blue, her breathing became irregular. The attendants gathered quietly around her bedside, holding lamps shaded with cloth to soften the light. One of them held her hand, stroking it gently with her thumb. Another whispered a prayer. Clementina's eyes fluttered open briefly, and in that final moment of clarity, she offered a faint smile, one that held gratitude rather than fear. She exhaled softly, like a sigh released after years of struggle, and then her chest fell still. At just 24 years old, she slipped away from the world with the same quietness that had marked her entire life. The news of her death passed through the palace with a muted solemnity. There were no dramatic displays of mourning, no great ceremonies to honor the Habsburg Princess who had sacrificed her health for a dynasty that barely noticed her suffering. Her children were too young to understand. Her husband remarried a few years later. The court returned to its routines, and Europe, embroiled in wars, treaties, and shifting regimes, barely acknowledged the passing of a young woman whose life had never been allowed to fully unfold. Thus ended the soft, brief life of Maria Clementina of Austria. A princess born fragile, a bride exiled by duty, a mother erased by illness, and a human soul whose suffering echoed only in the quiet memories of those who had witnessed it. Her death, like her life, was gentle, lonely, and heartbreakingly easy for the world to forget. In the days that followed Maria Clementina's death, Naples continued moving with the same restless energy it always had. The bustling markets, the noisy streets, the shifting tides of court politics. While the young princess, who had quietly suffered within its palace, faded almost immediately from public consciousness. Her passing was noted formally, dutifully, in the court gazettes. Her Royal Highness the Princess Maria Clementina has succumbed to illness. No elaboration, no tribute, no sense of the profound tragedy that had unfolded behind closed doors. In a world consumed by political upheavals, wars against Napoleon, and the ever-shifting alliances among Europe's great dynasties, the death of a fragile Austrian bride barely registered. She had fulfilled her expected role, produced heirs, and with that, the court seemed to believe her purpose had ended. Thus, her memory slipped quietly into the background, overshadowed by events far larger than her short, gentle life. Within the palace itself, the erasure happened even faster. Rooms once prepared for her comfort were refitted for other uses. Her personal belongings, the small devotional books she read during sleepless nights, the embroidered handkerchiefs she had held to her mouth during violent coughing fits, the letters from her sisters filled with longing and worry, were packed away into trunks and stored in corners of the palace few visited. Servants who had attended her faithfully were reassigned to other members of the household, their grief forced into silence as they resumed their duties. They had loved her in the quiet, personal way that simple people often love those who suffer, without expectation, with genuine devotion. For days after her passing, they still moved gently through the corridors, lowering their voices instinctively, as if she might still be resting in the next room. But the court around them surged forward with little interest in their mourning. Her husband, Francis, resumed his routine almost immediately. Observers noted how quickly he returned to public life, attending councils, reviewing documents, fulfilling his obligations with the same stiff detachment that had characterized his marriage. It was not that he celebrated her absence. Rather, he seemed relieved that the uncomfortable reality of illness and frailty no longer hovered at the edges of his domestic world. Within a few years, he remarried, choosing a new bride who would give him more children and play a more visible role in the royal household. Clementina's children grew up under the care of nurses and tutors. Their mother's memory gradually reduced to a name occasionally mentioned in genealogies. Caroline, the daughter who once touched her dying mother's hand with innocent curiosity, inherited nothing of the memory of the woman who had suffered so much to bring her into the world. Ferdinand, the infant whose weight had rested briefly on Clementina's failing chest, would never even know the sound of her voice. In Vienna, the news of her death caused genuine sorrow. But even there, the impact was softened by the distance that had separated her from her family for years. Her sisters wept, her mother prayed fervently, and for a moment, the Habsburg court felt the sting of a life lost too soon. But the empire was vast, the responsibilities numerous, and the rhythm of dynastic life unrelenting. As the months passed, Clementina became another portrait in a long gallery of archduchesses, a daughter who had fulfilled her duty, suffered quietly, and vanished before she could shape her own destiny. The official histories recorded her merely as a wife, a mother, a princess who died young. They did not record her long nights of breathless agony, her loneliness in a foreign land, her longing for home, her quiet endurance in the face of a fate she had never chosen. This erasure, subtle, swift, and nearly complete, revealed a deeper truth about royal women of her era. Their value lay not in who they were, but in what they could offer. Alliances, heirs, symbols of stability. Once they died, especially if they had lived without scandal or political influence, their stories were seldom told. Maria Clementina's suffering was not dramatic enough to attract writers. Her life did not contain rebellion, intrigue, or public tragedy. It contained something far more common, far more silent, and therefore far easier to overlook. The slow, private collapse of a woman trapped between dynastic duty and a body too fragile to withstand it. Even among the records of the Neapolitan court, mentions of her faded rapidly. Historians studying the Bourbon II Sicilies often gloss over her entirely, noting her only as the first wife of Francis, the mother of 2 children, and nothing more. She left behind no political legacy, no letters of influence, no acts that shifted the direction of the kingdom. What she left instead was the memory of a gentle presence, cherished by those few who knew her personally, but forgotten by the world that demanded everything from her and gave nothing in return. Yet in that forgetting lies a tragedy deeper than grand political downfalls or dramatic royal scandals. Clementina's life demonstrates how easily the suffering of quiet, obedient women is erased, how their pain becomes invisible, how their sacrifices are absorbed into the machinery of dynastic history without acknowledgement. She represents countless princesses whose names appear in genealogies, but whose stories were never allowed to live. Her absence from historical memory is not due to insignificance, but due to the very nature of her tragedy. Intimate, silent, overshadowed by the ambitions of those around her. The world moved on without her. Naples continued its ceremonies. Vienna marched toward new conflicts and new reforms. Her children grew up, her husband remarried, Europe shifted and burned through revolutionary fever. And Maria Clementina, the gentle Austrian princess who had coughed her life away, remained only a faint outline in the archives of history. Her life had been short, her suffering immense, her impact quiet. And in that quietness, history decided she could be forgotten. But forgetting does not mean she deserved to be erased. It simply means her story waited for someone, someday, to look beyond the official records and see the human being who lived, suffered, and vanished in silence. Maria Clementina's life, viewed from a distance, appears almost weightless. A brief shimmer on the vast tapestry of European dynasties, a name tucked quietly between more dominant figures, a line in genealogies that scholars pass over without pause. But when examined closely, her story exposes the profound human cost behind alliances, marriages, and empire building. Her legacy is not carved in monuments, not preserved in political reforms, not immortalized in works of art. Instead, it exists as something far more elusive, a reminder of how many women were born into power yet denied agency, destined to live and die according to decisions made by others. Clementina, with her frail lungs and gentle spirit, exemplified this tragic paradox more than most. She was born into a dynasty that shaped continents. Yet, she could not shape even the smallest corner of her own life. Her identity, as preserved in official documents, distills her existence into a few simple roles: Archduchess of Austria, Princess of Naples, wife of Francis, mother of 2 children. These roles define her historically, but fail to capture her humanity. The anxious breaths she took on cold Viennese mornings, the lonely steps she walked through the palaces of Naples, the quiet longing she felt for home even as her body deteriorated. History rarely records the inner lives of royal women who did not influence policy or survive long enough to become mothers of kings. And so Clementina's interior world, full of fears, hopes, tender moments with attendants, and silent endurance, has largely vanished, leaving behind only the skeleton of her biography. That erasure is its own tragedy, a reminder that power does not always grant visibility, and titles do not guarantee remembrance. Yet her story, when reconstructed through letters, court accounts, and the testimonies of those who cared for her, carries an undeniable moral weight. Clementina's life reveals the cruelty of dynastic expectations placed on fragile bodies. In her marriage, fertility mattered more than health. In her role as princess, appearance mattered more than emotional well-being. In her final illness, political convenience mattered more than compassion. Her suffering was not the result of malice, but of a system that prioritized alliances over individuals. That same system erased her once she was no longer useful. Her death, quiet, lonely, unceremonious, symbolized the disposability of women whose lives were defined by duty rather than desire. And her absence from historical narratives shows how quickly the world forgets those who never had the chance to assert themselves. Clementina also represents the thousands of women throughout European history whose stories were softened, minimized, or ignored because they did not fit the narratives of triumph or scandal that fascinated contemporaries. She had no dramatic downfall, no political influence, no public conflict. She simply suffered. She suffered through childhood illness, through a marriage devoid of affection, through her pregnancies, and through the slow rot of tuberculosis. But suffering, when endured quietly, rarely writes itself into history. This is why her legacy is not linked to political events, but instead to the intimate tragedy of a woman whose body betrayed her long before history did. Her life asks uncomfortable questions. How many princesses were sacrificed to diplomacy? How many died young because their health was secondary to their dynastic purpose? How many lived lives filled with yearning that no one recorded? And yet, despite all the forces that attempted to erase her, Clementina leaves behind a faint but persistent imprint, a humanizing counterpoint to the grand narratives of empire. In her struggle to breathe, we see the vulnerability the Habsburgs could not escape despite their power. In her longing for home, we see the emotional cost of arranged marriages. In her lonely death, we see the fragility hidden behind royal ceremonies. These moments, though absent from most historical accounts, speak to something universal: the quiet tragedies of those who live in the shadows of expectation. Clementina reminds us that history is not only shaped by the powerful, but also by those who suffered silently while the world turned its gaze elsewhere. Her children, though too young to remember her, continued the lineage she was forced to provide. Through them, her blood persisted even as her memory faded. But legacy is more than biological continuation. It is the imprint left on those who witnessed her life firsthand, the attendants who held her during endless nights of coughing, the physicians who recognized too late that she was dying, the sisters in Vienna who prayed desperately for news. Their grief, though unrecorded, forms part of the story that official histories overlooked. It is through these small, human details that Clementina's legacy takes shape, not as a political figure, not as a queen or regent, but as a fragile human being who bore the weight of expectation until it crushed her. Today, when her story is rediscovered, it serves as an act of restoration, a refusal to let her suffering remain invisible. In telling her story, we reclaim what history neglected: her tenderness, her endurance, her quiet tragedy, and her humanity. Maria Clementina's legacy lies in the truth her life reveals: that even within empires, even behind palatial walls, there existed lives marked not by power, but by pain, not by triumph, but by survival, not by glory, but by the simple, heartbreaking struggle to endure. She was never meant to be remembered, yet in remembering her now, We give meaning to a life that history left unfinished. A life short, fragile, and deeply human, whose quiet sorrow speaks across centuries to anyone willing to listen. Maria Clementina of Austria lived like a candle left too close to the wind, flickering, trembling, struggling to stay alight in a world that demanded more strength than she ever possessed. She was born fragile, married into loneliness, and died before she had the chance to truly live. Yet in that softness, in that quiet endurance, lies the truth of her humanity. She reminds us that behind every royal title is a beating heart. Behind every alliance is a person who must bear its consequences. And behind every forgotten name is a story that once mattered deeply. Her life may have been brief, her suffering silent, and her memory nearly erased. But in remembering her today, we restore dignity to a woman who never received it in her lifetime. And in doing so, we reaffirm a simple, human truth. Even the quietest lives deserve to be heard.